I wanted to get Dr. Stéphane Hallegatte to chime in at this point. He is the senior climate change advisor at the World Bank, but is also the lead author of a new report the bank has done on climate damages. And I was wondering whether you'd be able to tell us something about the current state-of-the-art understanding of India's climate vulnerability. How does it compare to other developing countries? And is there any evidence of impact on productivity or equity considerations that the bank finds from this new work?
So we created this diagnostics that we're now doing in all of the countries where we're working at the World Bank, which we call the Country Climate and Development Reports. And we published them for 47 countries in 2.5 years. So if you have a favorite country, you can just go and look at them. The way I'm describing them always is by saying those are not climate reports. They are development reports. The question we're asking in the case of India is not what is the vulnerability of India today. We're not asking how can you reduce emissions. Now we're asking how can countries achieve their development goals, and they vary across countries, even though they are affected by climate impacts, even though the world is decarbonizing and this affects technologies, trade flows, trade rules, cost of various energies. And even though those countries have made their own commitment, and you mentioned the NDC of India and the aspiration to become net zero in 2070. So the question is not to look at the static question, looking at a country at one point in time and looking at its vulnerability and so on, but more to look at the long-term development path and to try to align that path to the constraints, including the climate one. And so those reports, very mean with all of the teams, because I force everyone to start with a discussion about the development objectives and priorities and the development barriers that the country is facing, because that's the starting point to think about what you can do about climate. And so I think this is really important when you ask me about growth, because it depends a little bit if you're looking at growth now, or if you, for instance, start from the goal of being a high-income country in 2047, and you ask, okay, how do I achieve that objective with all of the challenges that the world is throwing at me, including climate change impact? And so I'll just describe a little bit how we're looking at these issues with a little bit more of technical details. I mean, of course, you're talking about growth. So you want to take a macroeconomic model and to just look at how the physical impact that we have in physical models. So it can be hydrology, it can be models of buildings and how they resist to floods, so very likely all of those engineering results that we get. And the question is, okay, what does it do to growth? And of course, we take a growth framework. So we're looking at, okay, what it does to the accumulation of physical capital. And you're looking at natural disasters and how floods destroys building and roads and so on. But we're also looking at natural capital. And I'm happy you mentioned water scarcity, because when we look at the agriculture sector, for instance, the impact through temperatures, higher temperatures, is actually relatively small compared with the likely impact through water scarcity, which is really the key challenge for the sector. So the natural capital is really important, and I'm talking about water, but it's also, I mean, the country is investing quite a lot in its forests, increasing the area afforested. Everybody's talking about the carbon stored in those forests, but those forests also help store water and slow flows of water. That also helps with natural disasters, floods, landslides, and agriculture. So we're looking at this dimension of the growth pathway. And of course, we're looking at labor productivity. And in a lot of our reports, the key direct impact on the growth number is through the impact of temperature on labor productivity. And of course, it's higher in countries that are hot and humid. And it's higher in countries where you have a lot of people doing physical activities outdoor. So it's really like your starting point in terms of climate and your economic structure. So this is all good, but just trying to expand a little bit the picture, the thing that we're trying to say is that first, we're doing climate and development reports, not climate and growth reports. And so the question of the distribution of those impacts is also very important. And the question of what it does to other things than just your income, we're also very interested in. So health, for instance, morbidity, mortality is also something that we're looking at very much. And here again, you find that the certain categories of people are much more exposed than others, either because they don't have access to infrastructure services or because they don't have access to air conditioning, for instance. But if we're looking at the distribution of those impacts, it's not only because there are these other dimensions, it's also because it matters for growth. And there's one thing that we find very, very strongly is because very poor people tend to be much more affected than the rest. If you're looking at the short run, if you're looking at the static picture, you might find very little impact on GDP. And that's because very poor people are very poor. And so when they're affected, it doesn't do a lot to GDP. If you take a development perspective and you want to be a high-income country in 2050 and beyond, the key is to have the population with good health, good skills, good jobs, and a large part of this process will be to take these people who are poor today and to make them richer. And so what happens to those people, even though over the short run, it might look small when you look at GDP numbers, if you take a perspective of accumulation of human capital for the long-term growth process, you might realize that you have a problem with those populations because they are more affected than the rest. And that if you're too focused on the GDP impacts, if you're using very simple models where you have one agent and one stock of capital and one stock of natural capital, you're kind of like missing the heterogeneity of those impacts, and you're completely missing also the long-term growth story. And that's why we're looking at these issues. We're talking about a people-centric approach. When we can, we discard a little bit the aggregated growth models and work more with micro simulations at the household level to understand what happens at the scale that matters the most, which is really the scale of the individual. That gives also a very different perspective on the solutions, right? Because then all of the human development sectors, which people might not think about first. If I say adaptation to climate change, you will imagine dikes and air conditioning and things like that. But in fact, education, access to healthcare, access to improved water and sanitation, all of those things become much more important if you take this macro vision instead of looking at aggregates. You mentioned financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is a fantastic adaptation measure because if people can borrow and if they can save in a safe form, so not in the form of livestock or in the form of their house, if you can save in a bank account, well, that's something that don't get flooded. So you become more resilient just because you have access to financial inclusion. And so I started by saying, you have to take the development perspective. What we get at now is the type of priorities we look into for adaptation to climate change and resilience tend to be the same thing that we're talking about when we talk about development and growth. You need well-educated population, healthy population, financial inclusion, access to all of those services and infrastructure services. And so the two things which sometimes we want to see as trade-offs, when you get into the, okay, what do I do tomorrow? We find that it's much more aligned when you look at the practical things than what it looks like if you just look at an aggregate model, very abstract and very aggregated. I don't want to be too long. I just want to finish with one thing. So you asked me about the impact on growth, and I interpreted that as climate change impacts. But I think if you want to achieve this very ambitious goal that India has given itself, investment will be the key, right? And so there's a question of how do I increase the investments in the country? And when you look at all of these climate measures, you can see them at cost, but you can also see them as investment opportunities. And when you run the numbers, some of those investments are pretty good returns. So it's probably also a good way to just incentivize more investments with high returns. And when you look again at the details, you start to again find a lot of alignment with what development would require, right? So if for instance, you're looking at this discussion on energy security and energy costs, because that's the problem when you're dependent on imports, is that you're vulnerable to changes in the price of energy. The shift, the extremely successful shift towards solar power in the country contributes to that, which is something that's good for economic growth and development. The country has less and fewer buses than countries at the same for the same population and development level. So using climate finance to try to promote like e-buses, which is something that a lot of people are working on. Again, if you look at the project itself, it's good for development. It reduces air pollution, it reduces emissions, but it's sort of like a side bonus, right? You want to do it for the development. And so my point here is, if you take this investment perspective and you try to identify good investments that are good for development and good for your climate objective and climate challenges, it's a very good way to get started with very targeted interventions that don't create those trade-offs. And I'm not suggesting that there are no trade-offs. If you look at the economy of India, you'll have some very difficult things that will create some hard trade-offs. But when you have a long list of opportunities in front of you, it doesn't hurt to just start with a list of priorities. And our CCDRs are really trying in a very non-prescriptive way to put on the table, help countries identify some of those opportunities that then we can seize and start with. And it's not that I'm saying that everything is easy. The political economy is complicated, the finance is complicated, but there are a lot of opportunities in front of us. I even managed to finish on a positive note.